You're listening to Pri-Zen, Life Lessons from Lockup. I'm Courtney Stewart. I'm a journalist, and I've been covering criminal justice issues in Virginia for 20 years.
I'm Jesse Crossan. I've been incarcerated since 2002, and we're here to share stories and experiences and perspective from one of the more than 2 million people incarcerated nationwide.
Hello, this is a prepaid debit call from...
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. I was up with the sun. What about you?
I was up before the sun, getting us head start on the day. I thought today we could cover the topic of violence. It's something that you and I have talked about a lot, and certainly it is an element of life in prison, something unfortunately that you've witnessed and experienced. So, I just thought we could start with that.
Okay. There's definitely been a lot of violence over the years, and stories of whether it's watching people get stabbed or watching people get their faces stomped on, or just these horrible things. But one of the ones that really stands out to me is almost the worst, not necessarily in like final injury, but just in kind of the sense of powerlessness. Someone had their TV stolen in a pod that I was in, and 2 guys got to fighting, and it actually turned out that the one guy was fighting the wrong person. He was not fighting the person who had stolen his TV, but he had been kind of tricked into believing he was. And the guy that he got into a fight with knocked him out and was on top of him, just pummeling him, just kind of unmercilessly. And the guards came in, and this was an institution that had attack dogs, and they released the attack dog. And rather than attacking the person on top who was attacking him, it latched onto the leg and mauled the leg of the unconscious man who was still getting punched in the face by the guy who had unintentionally been, attacked and not having anything to do with the TV being stolen. And it was just the most horrendous scene of just inhumanity and people not caring and blood and ugliness and powerlessness. That it really disturbed me, and it really has kind of stayed stuck in my memory as one of those horrible traumatic scenes.
Was that something that happened early on in your incarceration, or how long had you been there by that point?
Yeah, that was probably about 2 years in. I remember, if you want to talk about like violence on kind of a scary level. So I remember I got to Nottoway, which was the first real prison that I was at, and 2 days after I got to Nottoway, they would lock us all out of the cells, and then once everybody was out of the cells and breakfast was called, we would all go to breakfast. So it's like 5:30 in the morning or 6 in the morning, I can't remember exactly. And I'm sitting there against the wall, just like half awake, and somebody pulls this giant Rambo knife out and starts swinging at another guy who has like locks and a sock on the other side. And they just start like going to like gladiator combat at 5:30 in the morning, and I'm thinking, what did I just get myself into? Like, what is going on here? And that was my introduction to prison, unfortunately.
And so, you were engaged in violence in the crimes that you committed, but previous to that, this was not the life that you had been raised in. You weren't exposed to this kind of extreme violence prior to incarceration. Is that accurate?
No, I hadn't. And that's a really good point, because I think a lot of people grow up in neighborhoods and environments where this kind of violence is just common. It's just common. Is unfortunately everywhere. And I think about how kind of traumatized I've been over the years by certain individual sites I've seen or situations I've been in. I cannot imagine the psychological effect of people who have grown up in these kind of violent environments for their entire lives, and then the just complete lack of treatment and realization of the PTSD that has to be ubiquitous for the Department of Corrections.
So, we've talked in the past about different types of violence and sort of the root cause of maybe different types of violence. And I found that interesting. And so I would love to have you talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So in my experience, I've kind of divided violence into 3 categories. You have predatory, you have pragmatic, and you have fear-based violence. So the predatory violence is those people who essentially go out to prey upon other people, and it's just purely for kind of psychological reasons or internal reasons. They go out because that's what they like to do, or that's who they are. It's a coping mechanism. It's just kind of the most unhealthy or the scariest of the violences, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
The pragmatic violence is, for example, the guy who had his TV stolen. So he was told, hey, your TV was stolen. If you don't fight for it, you're never going to be able to keep anything again in your life. Like, that's it. So he went out and he attacked someone who they had told had sold his TV because he believed that was the only way that he could keep his stuff from being stolen in the future. And sometimes the kind of uglier side of pragmatic violence is there are guys that, for example, are hungry or don't have enough soap or don't have enough whatever and decide, hey, this guy does, and I can basically, through my violent action, through the act of taking from him or beating him up and taking his stuff, I can have that. And so there's a pragmatism to it. There's an end game. It's not just for prey. It's people feeling some kind of need or lack and acting upon it out of that. And then that kind of dovetails with the fear-based violence, which is basically when we react out of fear, and it's more when there isn't like a clear goal in mind, but it's out of an emotional reaction. And that's really how I classify. Like I'm in here for shooting two people, and essentially I was afraid. I was afraid, and I was out of control. And whether the threat to me was real or not is not necessarily the point, as much as I felt that it was. I felt just deeply at my core that I was going to die, and that I had to do something to protect myself, and that it's insane. It's the fact that that much cocaine and that much alcohol and that much delusion put together is just a ticking time bomb, and I was a manifestation of that ticking time bomb. But essentially, the thing about fear-based violence is if we remove the fear, if we treat the fear, if we treat what's going on, well, there is no violence because it comes directly out of that fear. So I think the other ones are a little more difficult to address because you're talking about inequity, or you're talking about just kind of a psychological factor that really is deeper and more deeply ingrained. But at least fear-based violence is the one that we can most easily address and work on.
So in terms of how the Department of Corrections or different prisons handle violence, what is the approach? I mean, how do they try to prevent it, and what is the response when it happens? And is there any treatment or attempts to get at the root cause of it?
Yeah, I mean that's a complicated question. I don't think there is enough. One of the biggest differences I've experienced since moving to Coffeewood, during the pandemic, was I went from 17 and a half years at an institution with cells to where there was a sense of safety. Like no matter what happened, no matter how crazy the world was, at night the door was locked and I only had either one other person or I was in there by myself. So there was a sense of safety that was just evident in everything that I did. At the end of the day, it felt safe. Whereas now I'm in a dormitory, and we've had a few, fights where it's shaking the ground. We had 2 300-pound guys get into a fight, which is, one of the scariest things you can imagine. Or, we had a fight the other day where somebody got their eyes split open. But there's no separation from it. You just have a row of bunks, and you don't know whether it's going to happen at 2 in the morning or 6 in the morning or in the middle of the day or in the evening. And it's really unnerving, at least for me. So, bizarrely, the Department of Corrections seems to be a little bit more lenient, or at least this institution seems to be a little more lenient on violence here than they were at other places, to where a lot of times when guys get into a fight, they'll just move them to different dorms, and they won't write paperwork, and they won't write charges, and they won't do it. And on one hand, I can understand, because putting people together in a situation like this in such inhumane conditions, I think they just understand and accept that there are going to be conflicts of character, and not everybody has the best conflict resolution tools, so that people get into fights. And they're not usually, at least from what I've seen, they're not nearly as bad or as severe as I've seen in other institutions. Because it's usually just something stupid. It's an argument or a disagreement, or you said something I didn't like, or you snore too loud, or just something stupid like that. But because the conditions that lead people who don't know how to cope or don't know how to resolve things in another way to get into a fist fight. In other institutions, again, it's complicated because you're talking about such a multifaceted thing. Are we talking about gang violence or personal violence, or are we talking about predatory? Again, what are we really looking at? But for the most part, there's a structure in place to punish those who are violent, at least in theory, to kind of separate them. And there's a level system in the prison system. So you have from 1 to 5, and you have S, which is security, which is basically like 24/7 lockdown. So if you stab somebody, you're going to a level S. You're going to red, and you're going to be locked in your cell for at least a year, for a long period of time, without being able to interact with other people, because they've deemed you a problem. They've deemed you dangerous, and therefore they're going to get rid of you until they believe that you've somehow reformed or changed. So there are multiple levels, but at the core is what you said. I don't think they treat the core of fear. I don't think they treat the core of traumatization. I don't think they really treat the core of what's going on. And sometimes that's just inequity. It's some people don't have enough to eat at the end of the day, and therefore they feel like they need to take from somebody else because they're hungry. And their family doesn't have enough money to send them to use make phone calls or send emails or buy food, and that doesn't make them feel very good. They don't feel a sense of worth out of that, and they respond in a violent way. And it's an unfortunate issue where you kind of have economics cross with the reform of the Department of Corrections.
I'm curious, you mentioned gang violence, and that is something, I mean, certainly it's something that you hear about, in the news. I mean, in Virginia, and just things like that happening. And then gangs in prison are certainly something that we've all heard about. To what extent is that a reality? I mean, is gang membership a major component of prison life?
I think it depends on where you are. I would say there's still far more like civilians or non-gang members than there are gang members in the Department of Corrections, but they're definitely kind of gaining steam and gaining. One of the guys that I'm here with just came from Nottoway, which is a receiving center, which is where I was years ago when it wasn't a receiving center. And when he went in, if he wanted to use the phone, basically he couldn't, or he had to ask permission because there was a blood phone and there was a crib phone and there was a Tidewater phone and everything was set up and controlled by groups or organizations. And that's becoming more of a reality. It's not a reality, for example, where I'm at right now, but it is a reality in other places. And I think it's growing. It was not nearly that big of a thing when I got locked up, and it has continued to grow. And I'm not sure necessarily what the kind of complex origin of that is, but it's very unfortunate because at least the gangs when I first came in were pretty well kind of controlled and regulated. You always had like old G's who would step in and make sure that things didn't get out of control, or for the most part didn't get out of control. And now it seems a lot more kind of young-minded and wide open and wild, and it's getting worse, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that would lead to greater likelihood of violence just on the face of it. If people are dividing into kind of us and them, and all of that. How would you categorize gang violence in terms of the predatory, pragmatic, or fear-based violence? Where do you think that falls?
Except for a few individuals, I would say it's both pragmatic and fear-based. I think ultimately when we feel like a scarcity of resources and we're essentially worried about our survival, which is, in my mind, where a lot of the kind of unity comes from, is a sense of we have to band together to be safe. And that's fear-based. That's it's not saying that people are afraid. It's just saying that they recognize a threat or they perceive a threat, and therefore they feel a need to be stronger in numbers, essentially. And then there's a pragmatic side where people realize, hey, this is either the life that I grew up in or this is the life that I've adopted since a certain period of time or adopted in prison, and that there are certain benefits to this. I'm going to gain certain things by doing this, and therefore I'm willing to put in this work or do these violent things because it benefits me. And it depends. I mean, some of the gangs are really serious and really. I remember we had a guy in the chow hall get stabbed up because he didn't do what he was supposed to do according to the gang lore. But on the other hand, I've seen a lot that are not as serious or is more just kind of together as a cliquish kind of situation. It depends on the individuals. It depends on the situation. It depends on the gang. But yeah, I would say normally they fall within the pragmatic and the fear-based.
And so how do you think, I mean, what could be done? I mean, you say it's increasing. How do you think, what do you think might work in terms of decreasing violence in prisons, or what have you seen work?
Okay. I think a lot of times, again, when I talk about people, being fear-based and interested in gangs, it's just because they come to prison and they feel small and they want to join something bigger themselves. So I think one, providing a safe environment would be paramount. If there's a way of ensuring safety, which means putting more officers on the floor, having better training, having more observation, and have it be less punitive and actually about resolution. Officers who are running around looking for ways to write charges, disciplinary offense reports for, you had your sheet up in the shower because you didn't want another man, 6 inches away from you looking at you, and you didn't feel comfortable with the fact that this man's a sex offender, and therefore, staring at you as he's washing himself. So you put a sheet up. Well, when they're writing a charge for that, I think they're missing what the real threat is, which is that eventually somebody's going to have that person look at him while he's in the shower and attack him and feel the need to defend himself or, have some traumatized memory come back up. So I think that things that work towards resolution rather than punitive are going to help. But yeah, providing safety first is I really think paramount, which means having more kind of oversight and more interaction and more involvement, not just looking from afar, but actually like being on the floor and seeing what's going on and trying to understand what's going on. But then also, when it comes to that, it comes to building connections or allowing the facilitation of connections that are built around healthier things. I remember we had this young guy come in who was just basically desperate for like a family. Like he had never had a family, and that's what he wanted. He didn't put that in words, but it was really clear based on what he just wanted to be loved and accepted by somebody. And he was kind of loud and he was kind of crazy and he was kind of erratic. So nobody really wanted to deal with him. And so what one of the gangs decided, hey, come hang out with us. Like, we'll take care of you. And they used him as their crash dummy. They would send him all the bad missions. They would send him to go steal stuff from people. They would send him to go just do all the really destructive stuff. But then they would reward him with the kind of emotional support or acceptance that he was looking for. And so I think that facilitating stronger relationships outside of that, whether it's with older prisoners who have, kind of turned their lives around and therefore can provide some kind of mentoring, or making phone calls and emails and visits more accessible and more reasonable. Saying during the pandemic when we haven't had visits for over a year, saying, okay, a 20-minute video visit is $8 or a 50-minute video visit is $16, which sounds like, a success when they put out a press release. The problem is a lot of people don't have that money. A lot of people don't have the money for 86-cent phone calls for 20 minutes. A lot of people don't have the chance to talk to their families or don't have strong family structures to begin with. So I think the more that community-based organizations can get involved, the more that religious organizations can get involved, the more that positive organizations and relationships can be created instead of negative ones, or instead of kind of criminal or fear-based or violence-based groups, the more that we solve that problem, the more people have an alternative.
Yeah, that makes sense. Have you seen, with the pandemic and the isolation and the end to in-person visits and all the challenges that's brought, do you think that has created more problems, or how have you seen that play out?
Yeah, it's been really, so before I left the last prison that I was at, it had gotten completely out of control. It was, people didn't have a place to go, people didn't have anything to do, people were sitting around, everybody was making wine. So you basically had a pod full of angsty, angry, lonely, isolated, drunk people getting into issues. I mean, before I left, there was a big gang issue. Where somebody got hurt, somebody got thrown off the tier, somebody got stabbed. It was really bad, and it was mostly as a result of a lack of structure and a lack of opportunity, and just people essentially having the same kind of exhaustion of the pandemic that people are having on the outside, but with the addition of violence or the potential for violence.
And on a sort of a different topic, going back to what we were talking about earlier, violence begets violence. It creates trauma, which then, creates people who are reactive in different ways. But certainly what happens to people outside before they end up in prison and exposure to violence seems like it has this enormous impact. Do you see that in the people that you are incarcerated with and have gotten to know over the years? Like, how does that play out?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think trauma and addiction, and usually they're tied together, are the number one issues. They're the number one things that drive, criminality. They're the number one things that drive violence. They are the issue to be solved. And I think there are other situations, and there are other specific cases, but I think on the whole, those are the issues. And I cannot tell you the number of people. I was a mentor in a mental health program in another prison, and I cannot tell you the number of people who have shared stories from their lives, either from their own families or from foster care or just from their time on the streets, that were so horrendous that it was everything I could do to not just kind of like break down sobbing. I've seen some terrible things in prison. I've seen some difficult things in life, but some of the experiences that these people have endured on a daily basis for the majority or the whole of their lives, it's just beyond comprehension. And this is unfortunately an issue going on. I read recently that the number one public health crisis in America is child abuse, and nobody talks about it. People will talk about heart disease. People will talk about, COVID. People will talk about other things. They won't talk about the fact that, the rates of child abuse are incredibly high, and the rates of traumatization are incredibly high, and the rates of abuse in relationships are incredibly high. And it's really kind of the unspoken fabric that everything else is built on. And it's really problematic.
Yeah, so really trying to look at this stuff happening early in people's lives is going to be a huge part of the foundation of trying to reform criminal justice, because you've got to get to the root cause of some of the violent behaviors.
1 minute remaining. Absolutely. I think providing counseling and care, trauma-informed care younger, will prevent people from coming to juvenile systems or coming to prison. I think providing trauma-informed care and addiction support in prison will prevent people from, coming back, will prevent violence in prison. I think that focusing on solutions rather than punitive responses is the number one answer. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that because there's not an immediate immediate return. You can lock somebody up, but you send somebody to counseling, it's not like you're going to change them overnight. But I think as we look into the future, we have to be looking in the long term, because otherwise we're just going to continue to sink dollars into a system that doesn't necessarily keep people safer, doesn't necessarily keep society safer.
Yeah. Well, I think we are out of time, but this was super interesting, and I will look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Talk to you then, Courtney.
All right. Bye, Jesse.
Thank you for using GTL.